Hey guys, welcome back. This one's all about anaerobic training. Now I've decided to split this video just to really make sure that in your brain you've understood that resistance training is not necessarily the same as anaerobic training. So this video is all about any of those running, swimming, jogging, cycling, etc. Styles of training that are going to elicit the anaerobic system but aren't necessarily putting the muscles under resistance-based pressure like going into the gym and doing a workout. So we're talking about sprint stop. So we're talking about the long interval training, okay? And so, plyometrics and a few of those different aspects in this video. Once again, we break it down into those three different systems: cardiovascular, respiratory, and muscular. But as it says here right at the start, and as I've mentioned in these videos, when we do anaerobic training, we mainly see changes in the muscular system and some in the cardiovascular, but the effects of anaerobic training are negligible for the respiratory system, so are not discussed. And I've already mentioned what happens with the diaphragm itself. So really what we're focusing on here with anaerobic training, and this shouldn't be a surprise to you, is the development of the ATP-PC and the anaerobic glycolysis systems becoming more effective and more efficient. So you might see improvements in the anaerobic capacity, someone's strength, someone's power, and someone's speed if they were to complete this style of training and get the benefits of the chronic adaptations I'm about to go through. Now, these are all the cardiovascular, heart, blood, and blood vessels responses to anaerobic training programs. Minimum of 6 weeks, training within the confines of the training principles, and making sure progressive overload was applied correctly. So we've already discussed within the cardiovascular system, it's not the size of the left ventricle like with aerobic training, it is the thickness of the ventricle wall that will increase. So if you have a look at this graph here with a non-athlete, an endurance athlete, and then an anaerobic-based, a non-endurance athlete, you can see how big the thickness of that wall of the ventricle actually is. So that's a significant jump and one of those major changes in the cardiovascular system. What that means is that the heart can eject blood more forcefully from the left ventricle out to the body. However, if we aren't seeing the aerobic training that increases the size of the ventricle, when the ventricle is still the same size that it is, so aerobic training hasn't taken place, regardless of how hard that heart can squeeze, the stroke volume isn't going to change because the amount of blood that is ejected out of the heart will still be the same. It will just be ejected more forcefully. So stroke volume will not change with anaerobic-based training solely. What you will notice, and this came up in our practice question the other day, is the systolic and diastolic. So the blood pressure on the walls of the arteries. Systole, meaning during squeezing motion, diastole, meaning during the relaxing motion. They will generally be decreased. So you will have a lower blood pressure of both systolic and diastolic if you are an anaerobically trained athlete. Now let's look at the muscular system, so the skeletal muscles, and what are the changes that take place for athletes who complete sprint training and long interval training, where there's a short sprint and a long rest, calling upon the phosphate creatine and the anaerobic glycolysis systems. What you'll notice is that the capacity of the ATP-PC and the anaerobic glycolysis systems will increase. That means that you will have higher energy substrates. So energy substrates are the fuels that those energy systems use. You'll have higher levels of those fuels in the muscles. You'll have higher amounts of enzymes within the muscles, and you'll also have a more capacity to use glycolysis within those muscles. So this occurs mainly within fast twitch fibers, even though the changes can happen in slow twitch fibers with that glycolytic capacity, but mainly we're talking about fast twitch fibers, which makes sense once again that we're talking about high intensity, lower duration type events. So Inside the muscle, you will have stored ATP, PC, creatines that are free of bonding with anything else, and glycogen. And with anaerobic training, each of those four aspects will have higher amounts of storage. That also means that the body can use the ATP-PC system more readily. The body has more stored ATP ready to go. And the body has some creatine for those phosphates to be able to bond to once they have broken away and used the energy of that bond. And then there's higher amounts of glycogen ready to go. So if we're thinking about going for that high intensity run, 10 seconds in, a lot of depletion of phosphate creatine, 20 seconds, 30 seconds in, a higher buildup of lactic acid, but we've actually got all the fuels ready to go to ensure that these systems at that high intensity can sustain as long as possible. The next thing that we'll look at is also enzymes. So this was mentioned earlier, ATPase, which is the enzyme that helps break ATP down to ADP. There will be a higher amount of that enzyme sitting inside the muscles, and there's also more glycolytic enzymes helping with the breakdown of glycogen. So the quantity and activity levels of the enzymes sitting in the muscle will increase. And what's really interesting for those people who do like looking at data and understand percentages well is having a look at how much of an increase you actually get in some of these aspects. So the enzymes themselves can increase by about 35%. Glycogen content can increase by 20%. Phosphate creatine up to 30%. So if we're talking just in very basic terms of somebody having 10 seconds of phosphate creatine being able to go to whoa, they can now have an extra 30% of that. That's 13 seconds of phosphate creatine. Now, it doesn't exactly work out like that because all three energy systems are always producing energy, and we don't necessarily call upon all the phosphate creatine all at the same time for the longest duration possible. However, to know that that's there is a huge benefit for the ATP-PC system. In the final section here, we start to talk as well about this glycolytic capacity and the glycolytic enzymes that I've mentioned, but also have a think about how this works together. If we have more enzymes helping with the breakdown and they're more active, and we have more fuel storage, this means that more ATP, those 38 ATPs at a time, oh, my apologies, 2 ATPs from one glucose molecule without the presence of oxygen, but it can happen more readily and more frequently and more quickly. So therefore, we can call upon the anaerobic glycolysis system, and if we're only doing an event like a 400 meter that lasts for that sort of 45 seconds or so, and we can deal with the lactic acid buildup, we can actually produce ATP faster, meaning we can move our muscles faster, meaning we will hopefully win the race. And then I just mentioned lactic acid, and it's been mentioned once or twice. We have to understand this, and I've highlighted it and underlined it as much as I possibly can here. With anaerobic training, athletes are able to tolerate higher levels of blood lactate during maximal exercise. And if we skip all the way through this and come back to it, there is no evidence that the buffering capacity of that lactate is increased with training. So what this is all about is that while the body's calling upon anaerobic glycolysis to be the predominant supplier of energy for higher intensities and for longer periods of time, there will be a higher generation of lactic acid and lactate, and those byproducts will have a higher tolerance from the athlete, meaning the athlete is able to work at those high intensities for a little bit longer. A lot of this is due to motivation as well as improving sort of just the tolerance of being able to deal with the pain mechanism that takes place as the body does build up lactic acid and the brain tells us my muscle is sore, I should slow down. So there's that summary. Feel free to pause the video now as I'm about to end it and write down what all those changes are, but I think I've just been able to go through them all in this quick video. I am coming at you with one last video for today, which is all about the changes that you will see from resistance-based training.